There's a problem with the Rockefeller origin story, and it's not the kind of problem you usually hear about in textbooks or documentaries. It's a quieter issue, a gap. A gap in the historical record that most official biographies acknowledge only briefly before moving past it and replacing it with a much more comfortable narrative. Because what the documents show about the Rockefeller family before 1858 and what they show after 1865 are two very different realities. This isn't just the familiar story of a poor family becoming wealthy through hard work and discipline. That's the version most people already know. The real issue is that before a certain point in time, the Rockefeller family barely appears in meaningful financial records at all. And then, within about a decade after that point, they're connected to some of the most powerful industrial infrastructure in the Western world. That speed matters. And when you place that speed inside its historical context, the standard story of a self-made man rising from nothing starts to feel incomplete. So instead of starting with mythology, let's start with what the historical record actually shows. Not the polished biographies written with access to Rockefeller family archives. Not the academic narratives shaped over decades by institutions funded by Rockefeller philanthropy. Just the documented record itself. Because that record tells a very different story about where John D. Rockefeller came from. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, appears in the historical record as an itinerant trader and patent medicine salesman moving through upstate New York and parts of the Midwest during the 1840s and 1850s. He called himself a botanic physician, selling herbal remedies and cancer cures from a traveling wagon. At one point in 1849, he was even named in a warrant connected to a rape charge in Cayuga County, New York. Later in life, he abandoned his family and began living under an assumed name, William Leviston, in South Dakota. When he died in 1906, his estate was minimal. This was the paternal background of the man who would later become, by most inflation-adjusted estimates, the richest individual in modern history. According to the official version of events, John D. Rockefeller built his fortune through discipline, careful accounting, relentless reinvestment, and extraordinary organizational skill. He entered the emerging oil industry at exactly the right moment and applied business practices that were aggressive but technically legal. And it's important to say this clearly. Many parts of that explanation are supported by evidence. Rockefeller was disciplined. He was systematic. He was extremely effective at reducing costs and building large-scale business structures. But those traits explain how Standard Oil became powerful. They don't fully explain how it started. The early years matter here. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York. His family moved to Cleveland in 1853. By 1855, at just 16 years old, he was working as a clerk in a produce commission house. 3 years later, in 1858, he left that job and started his own produce commission business with a partner named Maurice Clark. According to the official account, the startup capital for that business came from two sources: $1,000 of Rockefeller's own savings and a $4,000 loan from his father. Today, that $4,000 would be roughly equivalent to about $130,000. And this is where the arithmetic starts getting interesting. A produce clerk in Cleveland during the 1850s typically earned somewhere between $300 and $500 per year. Even with extreme frugality, saving $1,000 in just 3 years would have been difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. The larger question is the father's contribution. Where did William Avery Rockefeller get $4,000? The documented income of a traveling patent medicine salesman in that period doesn't easily support the idea that he could lend that amount of money. Yet that loan becomes the foundation of Rockefeller's first independent business venture. And that venture succeeded. The Produce Commission partnership grew quickly. Then, in 1863, Rockefeller and Clark moved into oil refining in Cleveland, forming a partnership with a refinery operator named Samuel Andrews. Within roughly 7 years, that partnership evolved into what would become Standard Oil. This transition, from produce merchant to owner of the largest oil refining operation in the United States, happened in about a decade and a half. That timeline is the central mystery. The standard explanation credits Rockefeller's organizational skill, his willingness to negotiate railroad rebates, his ability to reduce costs, and his creation of the trust structure that eventually consolidated the American oil industry. All of those things are real, all of them are documented. But there's still a missing piece. Because building oil refineries in the 1860s required serious capital. Buying competing refineries in Cleveland during the early 1870s required even more. Rockefeller moved faster than his competitors, and several of those competitors later testified before Congress that the speed of Standard Oil's expansion suggested access to capital resources far beyond what a Cleveland produce merchant could normally accumulate. Railroad companies didn't offer major freight rebates simply because Rockefeller was persuasive. They did it because he controlled volume, and controlling volume required infrastructure. Infrastructure required capital. So where did that capital come from? The official answer is disciplined reinvestment. Rockefeller repeatedly said that every dollar he earned went back into the business. Over time, compounding growth created enormous scale. That explanation makes sense in theory. But when you compare the timeline to the scale of expansion that actually occurred, it starts to feel incomplete. Between 1870 and 1879, the decade when Standard Oil established its dominance, enormous capital flowed into refinery acquisitions and railroad arrangements. The sources of that capital aren't clearly documented in the surviving early business record. Even investigators at the time noticed this. In 1872, Congress examined the South Improvement Company, an early arrangement connected to Standard Oil's railroad relationships. Members of the investigative committee, several of whom were experienced businessmen themselves, openly expressed confusion about how quickly Rockefeller had accumulated both capital and influence. They weren't questioning whether he had done it. They were questioning how. And that question leads directly into the historical window that matters most. The period between 1858 and 1865, because that window overlaps with something else entirely: the American Civil War. And the Civil War wasn't just a military conflict. It was the largest redistribution of economic resources the United States had ever experienced up to that point. The Civil War changed everything. It didn't just decide the future of the Union. It reorganized money, supply chains, transportation networks, political influence, and industrial opportunity on a scale the country had never seen before. Fortunes were made in a matter of years. Entire industries were accelerated by wartime demand. And government contracting became one of the fastest ways for private actors to accumulate enormous amounts of capital. That matters because Rockefeller and Clark's Produce Commission business did not simply survive during the war years. It appears to have done extremely well during exactly the period when wartime supply networks were creating unusual opportunities for fast capital accumulation. Official biographies acknowledge this in a very general way. They point out that Cleveland was an important distribution hub for agricultural goods moving east, and that wartime demand increased the value of foodstuffs and transportation. That much is true. A well-positioned produce merchant in Cleveland during the Civil War could absolutely make money. But that still doesn't answer the deeper question. Was Rockefeller's wartime success just the result of legitimate produce trade? Or were Rockefeller and Clark involved, directly or indirectly, in government contracting relationships that could have generated profits far beyond what normal commercial activity would explain? That question matters because Civil War contracting was famously profitable and notoriously corrupt. Congressional investigations from the era documented overcharging, kickbacks, politically connected supply agreements, low-quality goods sold at high prices, and in some cases payments made for deliveries that were incomplete or never actually fulfilled. This was not a small side effect of the war economy. It was built into the system. And if Rockefeller's capital truly surged between 1858 and 1865, then the Civil War is not just background context. It becomes the most important financial context in the story. The problem is that the contract records for the Rockefeller and Clark partnership during those exact years are not fully accessible in any straightforward public archive. The Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, holds extensive material on Rockefeller's later business life. Once you get into the mid-1860s, and especially the Standard Oil years, the documentation becomes much richer. But the record from the earlier period, the years that would help answer the capital question most directly, is noticeably thinner. Now, that could mean several things. It could simply reflect the reality of a young business keeping less complete records. That happens. Many early commercial firms did not preserve documents systematically. Fires, moves, neglect, and simple disorganization destroyed countless business papers in the 19th century. But it could also reflect something else. The basic reality that archives are never neutral. This is not a paranoid observation. It's just how archives work. Any archive curated by the people, families, or institutions connected to the subject it documents is necessarily selective. It doesn't have to be falsified to be selective. It doesn't have to invent anything. All it has to do is preserve some things, lose others, prioritize certain narratives, and make some lines of inquiry easier than others. The Rockefeller Archive Center is a serious scholarly institution. It has supported valuable historical work, but it was created by Rockefeller family interests, funded through Rockefeller institutions, and built around preserving the historical legacy of one of the most powerful dynasties in American history. That doesn't automatically invalidate the material it holds. But it does mean historians working within that archival framework are working from a curated record. And what seems to be missing from that curated record is exactly the material that would help answer the most important question. Where did the early capital come from? The official answer remains the same. Successful trade, discipline, and reinvested profits. But the alternative explanation is not difficult to imagine, even without jumping into more speculative territory. The alternative is that Rockefeller's early capital may have come from sources connected to the wartime economy. Government supply contracts, privileged access to distribution networks, post-war resource transfers, or relationships with emerging financial actors in New York and the railroad industry. That explanation stays within the known structures of 19th century American history. It doesn't require secret civilizations or hidden continents. It only requires us to take the wartime economy seriously as a mechanism for rapid wealth creation. And yet, there is another framework, one that is far more controversial, which has gained traction online precisely because the official story feels so incomplete. That is the Tartaria framework. Now, whatever one thinks of Tartaria research as a whole, it raises a set of questions that are worth separating from its strongest claims. Because the appeal of the framework is not just in the answers it offers, it's in the anomalies it points to. In the Rockefeller case, Tartaria researchers focus on the same basic mystery the conventional record struggles with: the speed of Rockefeller's rise. The scale of capital he seemed to command early on, the ease with which he moved into powerful railroad and banking relationships, and the impression, visible in hindsight, that he was operating inside structures of power that a young Cleveland merchant should not have been able to access so quickly. Those are real questions. Where the conventional explanation says genius, discipline, timing, and reinvestment, the Tartaria framework suggests something very different. Not personal inheritance from his father, but access to already existing resources, infrastructure, networks, or systems that were being reorganized in the mid-19th century. In that reading, the industrial giants of the post-Civil War era did not build everything from scratch. They took control of things that were already there: physical systems, financial channels, or institutional frameworks that had deeper origins than official history is willing to acknowledge. That is a major claim, and it is not proven by the documentary record. But the reason people find it compelling is that the official record leaves so much unexplained. And that sense of anomaly doesn't stop with Rockefeller's finances. It extends into the broader landscape of American institutional life in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. The period just before the great industrial fortunes fully emerge. This is where architecture and infrastructure often enter the conversation. Across American cities, you see civic buildings, financial institutions, government structures, and transportation systems that, to some researchers, appear too large, too sophisticated, too expensive in real terms, and too rapidly realized for the supposedly limited technological and economic base of the period. Mainstream historians reject most of the conclusions drawn from that observation, and in many cases, they have good reason to. 19th century engineering was capable of extraordinary things. The railroad expansion alone, however brutal and costly in human terms, was real. It happened. Large structures were built, often under miserable labor conditions, using methods that evolved quickly under pressure. So the existence of big infrastructure is not by itself proof of inheritance from a lost civilization. But the larger question still lingers. Was the infrastructure context in which Rockefeller rose truly being built from nothing in real time? Or was it being reorganized, consolidated, and financialized at a speed that suggests access to pre-existing resources and systems? That question becomes harder to ignore when you look not just at Rockefeller, but at the cluster of fortunes emerging around him. Because Rockefeller is not alone. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, Andrew Carnegie was already accumulating experience and connections in railroad and telegraph operations around Pittsburgh. J.P. Morgan was beginning his banking career in New York. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had built wealth in steamships, pivoted into railroad consolidation with remarkable speed in the 1860s. It's different sectors, different personalities, but the same narrow historical window. That pattern is what gives the whole story its strange shape. It starts to look less like isolated self-made geniuses, independently seizing opportunity, and more like a coordinated reordering of the American economy. And that is really where the Rockefeller story stops being just a biography and starts looking like a structural question. Because once you widen the frame, Rockefeller no longer appears as a single, exceptional figure rising in isolation. He appears as part of a concentrated historical pattern. In a surprisingly short span of time, the United States produces a handful of dominant industrial and financial powers. Rockefeller in oil, Carnegie in steel, Morgan in finance, Vanderbilt in railroads. And these figures do not simply become rich. They become foundational. They occupy entire sectors. Now, there is no document showing these men sitting around a table and dividing the American economy among themselves. Nothing that explicit exists in the historical record. But when you look at the pattern of their rise, the timing is difficult to ignore. Their interests often aligned more than they conflicted. Their sectors complemented each other. Their relationships with banks, railroads, and political figures gave them access to forms of leverage that ordinary competitors simply did not have. The conventional explanation is that this was the natural outcome of industrialization, that huge opportunities appeared, extraordinary men seized them, and the winners emerged through a mix of intelligence, discipline, timing, and ruthlessness. And again, some of that is obviously true. But the issue is not whether Rockefeller was talented. The issue is whether talent alone explains the scale and speed of what happened. Because once Standard Oil was underway, Rockefeller's abilities are easy to see. He was exceptionally good at organization. He understood cost structures better than most of his rivals. He was relentless about efficiency, volume, and control. He used railroad rebates, acquisitions, pressure tactics, and legal structures with extraordinary sophistication. These traits explain how Standard Oil became dominant. But they still do not answer the earlier question. Where did the first serious capital come from? That is the question that keeps returning. And it keeps returning because the official story never really resolves it. It moves around it. It softens it. It substitutes a moral narrative, thrift, discipline, reinvestment, genius, for a financial explanation. And those are not the same thing. By the 1890s, another layer enters the story: philanthropy. Rockefeller did not just build a business empire, he built an apparatus for shaping public memory. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, became one of the most influential private institutions in the modern world. Rockefeller money flowed into universities, medical schools, libraries, museums, research programs, think tanks, public health initiatives, and academic scholarship. This does not mean every historian funded in that intellectual environment was dishonest. It does not mean the entire historical profession was secretly manufacturing lies on behalf of the Rockefeller family. What it does mean is something more ordinary, and in some ways, more powerful. Funding shapes inquiry. Institutions tend to support questions that fit comfortably within the world they are helping to build. They are less likely to support questions that destabilize the moral legitimacy of their own origins. Over time, this creates a narrowing effect. Certain topics become normal, others become eccentric. Some questions are considered serious scholarship. Others get pushed to the margins before they are even fully asked. And in the case of Rockefeller, the question that seems to have been sidelined from the beginning is the most basic one of all. How exactly was the early accumulation financed? Ida Tarbell's famous investigation of Standard Oil, published in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904, is often treated as the definitive exposé of Rockefeller power. And in many ways, it was extraordinary. Tarbell documented the rebate system, the predatory practices, the coercion, the industrial espionage, the political influence, and the methods through which Standard Oil crushed competitors. But Tarbell was mainly focused on how Standard Oil operated once it had already become powerful. She did not solve the capital question. She showed how Rockefeller used power. She did not fully explain where the original scale of that power came from, and that distinction matters. The surviving pre-1860 record is not empty. It tells us certain things. It tells us about William Avery Rockefeller's patent medicine business. It tells us about the family's movements through New York. It tells us that John D. Rockefeller attended a commercial college in Cleveland, worked in a produce house, learned bookkeeping, and built a reputation for seriousness and discipline. What it does not give us is a coherent documentary bridge between those modest beginnings and the level of capital deployment visible by the early 1860s and accelerating into the 1870s. That bridge is assumed. It is assumed because the narrative says it must be there. But assumption is not documentation, and reputation is not arithmetic. And the arithmetic is the part that keeps refusing to go away. The official account says Rockefeller saved aggressively, borrowed from his father, prospered in produce, reinvested constantly, and then entered oil at exactly the right moment. Fine. But if that explanation is sufficient, then someone should be able to walk through the numbers in detail and show how the documented income of the relevant years produced the capital visible in the next phase. That kind of reconciliation has never really been done in a satisfying way. Not in the biographies, not in the public memory, not in the broad institutional story Americans are taught about the rise of industrial capitalism. Instead, the missing years are treated as a hazy prologue. The real story, according to the official account, begins once Rockefeller's success is already underway. But that is precisely the problem. The beginning is where the unanswered question lives, and there are still places one could look. Cleveland city directories from the 1860s provide information about business addresses, partnerships, and commercial identities during the exact period when Rockefeller's capital seems to have been growing unusually fast. Congressional records from Civil War profiteering and supply investigations may contain partial clues about who was connected to military provisioning networks. Railroad company records from the late 1860s and early 1870s can shed light on the freight relationships that made Standard Oil's expansion possible before the trust was formally consolidated. These sources exist, but they have not been systematically interrogated from the specific angle that matters most: the capital question. And that may be because once a fortune becomes legitimate enough, society stops asking how it was born. The buildings remain, the institutions remain, the foundations, universities, museums, policy centers, libraries, and research programs remain. The wealth gets transformed into cultural authority, and cultural authority shapes the acceptable boundaries of historical memory. That is how suppression usually works in the real world. Not through a dramatic conspiracy in the cinematic sense, but through selection, curation, prestige, and repetition. Through funding some questions and neglecting others. Through rewarding narratives that stabilize institutional legitimacy and sidelining narratives that threaten it. So let's reduce the issue to its simplest form. Before 1858, the Rockefellers show no recorded wealth remotely proportional to what would soon appear. Then, within a relatively short period, They are at the center of the most powerful oil enterprise in the world. The official bridge between those two realities is genius and reinvested profit. Maybe that bridge is real. Maybe the missing records, if ever fully recovered, would show that the whole thing was less mysterious than it now appears. But based on the record we actually have, the bridge does not feel complete. The arithmetic strains, the timeline strains, the historical context strains. And that is why the gap matters. Not because every alternative theory is automatically true. Not because the Tardaraya framework is proven. Not because every institutional silence is evidence of deliberate deception. But because the most important question in the Rockefeller origin story has never been examined with the seriousness it deserves. The record is there. The gap is there. The arithmetic is there. What has been missing is the willingness to follow that arithmetic wherever it leads, without beginning from the assumption that the official conclusion must already be right.